Imagine you're a farmer living 1,000 years ago in some remote mountain region somewhere. Your day to day life consists of watering your crops and taking care of chickens and, harvesting or whatever. And then one day, a traveler happens to be passing by your farm and you get to talking. And that traveler brings up in kind of an offhand way, like, oh yeah, the war is actually over now. And you find out that you live in the Persian Empire. Not only do you live in the Persian Empire, but you've lived in the Persian Empire for a while because the war has been over for quite a while, but you're just now finding out about it. You went to sleep last night thinking that you lived in the Roman Empire under the Roman Emperor, and you're finding out now that that wasn't true. Throughout most of history, this is how everything worked. History itself moved at two distinct speeds. There was the speed of events, and then there was the speed of information. Something happened, and then at a later time, people found out about it. And that second time happened different for everybody. Some people found out quick, some people found out way after the fact. The problem is that the way we think about history and the way we learn about history, it gets distorted because in a history book, you are only learning about things at the speed of events. This happens and then this happens. You hear about, oh, there was a war from 1531 to 1539. And it sounds like that war went for 8 years. It sounds like that was an action-packed 8 years. But in reality, on the level of events, that 8 years wasn't continuous warfare. If you were the king back then and you were controlling your army, all you could do was you make a decision. Move the troops from here to there. Send a garrison to Gaul. Attack the flank. You send out that message on some sort of courier, and then you just wait. You go back to your castle and you wait for months of silence. All you can do is pace around your castle and think about what the other guy might be doing at the time. And you're not even going to find out about whatever happened until eventually, somebody on horseback comes racing into your village and they have to tell you, oh, it went bad and everybody is starving back there. Even when you hear that a war went for 8 years, it's easy to forget. Traditionally, war wasn't even fought year-round. People took winters off. So you would go out, your army would go out somewhere, and they would fight the battle for you. And then right around, October, November, they would just stop. And wherever they were, that's where they set up camp on both sides. And then you spent the winter huddled up in a tent somewhere, being cold. So that's what the experience was like for the soldier on the ground. We read about the story of this army fought this army at that date. And then a year later, they fought over here. For that soldier, it was a lot of waiting around. Much like for the king. All you could do was think about what might be happening and what might be coming up next. Because for that soldier who was waiting for the king to give orders, their day-to-day lived experience was being cold, being in the mud. So even if we think about it as being this epic battle in history, that's not how it felt on the ground for anybody. Throughout most of human history, the dominant experience has been one of waiting and quiet. Even warfare. You hear about this now as the army, they always say, hurry up and wait. It was like that back then times 1,000. It was all waiting around. And it was in that waiting that most people would die. Most soldiers throughout history didn't die by catching an axe in the back of their head. They died from the mud. They died from, diarrhea, stomach problems, dehydration, just from waiting around to hear about what was going to happen next. I mean, you hear about, Schrodinger's cat. That was a famous thought experiment. You take a box and you put a cat inside and you throw a radioactive isotope in there and you close the box. For that moment, while the box is closed, you don't know if the cat is alive or dead. So until the cat is observed, it exists in kind of a liminal space. It exists in between life and death. That's what most of human experience was forever. You were always living at two different levels at the same time. You were the farmer who was watering the crops and chasing chickens around. You're the soldier who is stuck in the mud somewhere and you're miserable and you're cold. While at the same time, you exist in the level of history, in the level of empire. And you find out about the Persian Empire, and you learn that this emperor just got assassinated, and these things have now changed. In America, we celebrate Juneteenth, which is a holiday commemorating, it was like in Texas, when the slaves in Texas found out that slavery was now outlawed, and they were now free. This holiday of Juneteenth is not the day that slavery was outlawed. It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth is a holiday of when people found out. Those were completely separate times. Slavery was outlawed, and then eventually word got out, and then that was the cause for celebration. So for those slaves back then, they found out that they were free, but they also found out that they had been free for a long time, and nobody had told them. So for that time period, their lived experience was that of slavery, but their technical, political experience in terms of history was of free men. They didn't even know about it, though. And that's why, like I'm saying, there used to be two different speeds of event and information. That has collapsed, obviously, in the modern world. Things happen, and then we find out about them pretty much instantly. A war happens halfway around the world, and we're all following it on our phones, and we find out this happened, then this happened. So it feels like we are living in a world where we know things, and it feels like we're experiencing them, reality, in a more direct manner, just because we can talk to each other faster and the information can travel. The problem with this is that it leads to a kind of schizophrenia. This leads to, I think, profound mental disturbance, because when you think of your own knowledge as being total, as if you think about yourself as knowing your own life and also knowing the context that you live in, knowing everything that's happening in the world at once, this leads to grandiose thinking. This leads to a kind of egomania where you think that you start to think about yourself as a historical figure. You think about yourself not just in your lived experience, but also in a narrative arc. You start thinking about yourself in the hero's journey, and you start seeing other people as benchmarks on your journey. And you start thinking about your life not as the farmer who has to take care of his crops, but as, a brand, as somebody who is on the road to success. And this is schizophrenic because you can't live on both levels at once. When you take yourself out of the moment, out of your lived experience, you are now in a completely different place. You are now on the observation deck, looking at yourself. You cannot live your own life and evaluate your life at the same time. Those are distinct actions, and trying to do both at once is what makes people insane. And that's what causes so much of modern anxiety, is that we all realize that we all live in a historical context that we can't see the end of. We all know that we are in the middle of a climate change disaster, but we don't know how it turns out. We can all feel it, though. And we can all feel AI technology will probably be profoundly disruptive to human experience. But we don't know how, and we don't know where we are in the story. So what we end up doing is repeating it to ourselves and trying to think about our own lives on the grand scale. And that is not possible. The way to think about this, really, especially when you think about, the life of the hypothetical farmer we're talking about. You think about the life of the soldier back then who was stuck in the mud and he was cold and hungry. The thing to keep in mind about these people is that they are both long dead. That farmer is dead and their body has become dust. And the dust has become dust. And that soldier who died in the war, best case scenario, he is part of a paragraph on Wikipedia somewhere. This battle happened, this many people died, and this nameless person was one of those people. And that's how they ended up. But this isn't nihilism. I'm not saying that nothing these people did mattered. What I'm saying is that farmer who found out he lived in the Persian Empire, it was an interesting thing to find out. I'm sure that is a, kind of world-shattering moment for a little while. But eventually, the traveler who told him that is going to move on with their life. The farmer is going to go to sleep and wake up the next day. And they got to get back to the crops because at the end of the day, they are a farmer.